All right, welcome back. In today's lesson, we are going to talk about array lists, which are very similar to arrays, but they're a little bit different. So we're going to talk about that. And so, first off, what is an array list? Well, if we go back to thinking about arrays, what's an array? An array is just a collection of things. And I've written right here just how you would declare an array, right? Where you have the type and these brackets here. This is you telling processing that, hey, this variable I'm about to make is going to be an array because you have these two brackets here. You have your name, it's equal to a new, and you have a type, should match whatever type you want. But then we have these other brackets here with this number. And this is the thing I kind of want to focus on right here, is that with an array, you have to define the size of the array right at the beginning. So like, this little line right here, this is me defining an array of size 10. And so this means this array, called an array, has 10 slots. It will only have 10 slots. It will never not have 10 slots. Okay, so that's what an array is. It's a collection of things, but it has a fixed size. But what if you want to change the size over time? Because you saw earlier in the lesson on arrays, I had the bouncing ball example, and maybe you did the bubble assignment there as well. But, I could change the value of this number, and it would change the number of bouncing balls I had on the screen, which is cool, right? It made it very powerful, very easy to change the amount of things on the screen. But what if I want the number of things on the screen to change over time? Where maybe at some point I have 5 balls bouncing around, but then over time, maybe every 30 seconds, another ball's added or something like that, right? Well, how do I do that with an array if the size is fixed? Well, it turns out you can't, but let's say, same thing, well, if you had bubbles where maybe you wanted to generate some bubbles, and then once they hit the top, they pop and they go away forever, but then whenever you click the mouse, you add some more or something like that. Well, the amount of things on the screen, the amount of things in this collection of things is changing over time. Well, an array, though, can't handle that because it's a fixed size. Or let's think about a more practical example, especially if you're thinking about making a game or something like that. Let's say you have enemies on a screen. Oftentimes, you'll have all these enemies stored in an array or a collection of things. It's going to be in some sort of collection. Well, if you have enemies and maybe you shoot them or you slash them or something, right? At some point, these enemies should disappear, right? Like if their health goes to 0 or something like that. But that means that if there's 4 enemies on the screen and then you kill one of them, there should only be 3 enemies on the screen now. But how can we make that happen if they're stored as a collection of things? Well, an array has a fixed size. So if it says there's 4 slots, there's always going to be 4 slots. You can't change that. So how can we handle this? How can we still have a collection of things, which is very useful, but how can we change the size of that collection of things? How can we make it so that things can be added and things can also be taken away? Well, that's what an array list is going to help us do. So let's talk about that. So that's the main thing about array lists, is that they are dynamic. What do I mean by that? I mean that they're still a collection of things, just like an array, but their size can be changed at any time. If you want to make it bigger and add things to it, easy peasy. If you want to subtract things and remove things from that, that's very easy as well. That's going to be the main benefit of ArrayList over arrays, is that ArrayList have a dynamic size that can change, but an array has a fixed size. And so let's actually step away from the slides for a second. Let me show you some examples. And so you've seen this one already. This is the one with arrays, the bouncing ball with arrays. So I have my number here. This is going to be the size of the array. So when I press play, you see the number was 50. I have 50 bouncing balls here. If I change the number to 5, run it again, you see I have 5 in this case now. Cool. It's very powerful, very awesome. But, once I have some bouncing balls, I can't remove them in any way. There's nothing I can do to affect that, right? And so, that's not what we want, at least in this case, right? And so with an array list, though, and we'll look at this whole sketch in detail. If I press play, I have it set up so that I start off with nothing, but whenever I click the mouse, I'm going to add a ball, and whenever I press a key on the keyboard, I'm going to subtract a ball. So I'm going to click, there's a ball. Click, click. I'm going to do some fast clicks, and you can see I'm adding balls dynamically to my array list. That's pretty cool. Now I'm going to press a key, I'm going to press the space bar, and that should remove some balls. And you see they're starting to disappear. So you see, it's pretty much the same thing as the array sketch, except I can dynamically change how many things are in that array list, which allows me to, of course, display and kind of control different amounts of things over time, which is very fun, very cool. And if you think about the final game, something like that, this is very useful because if you have, if you're making a game where it's shooting asteroids at you, well, you'll want to generate those asteroids at some point, so you're going to add them to your array list. And then maybe once they hit you or once they fly off screen, you want to remove them because they're not in play anymore. Well, you need to remove them from the array list. And so an array would not allow you to do that, but an array list would. And so that's going to be the benefit of using an array list. Has all the strengths of an array, but it also has a dynamic size. Alrighty, so let's talk about that. Now, I do want to point out that an array list is actually not made in processing. It's not in the processing language necessarily. Well, it's not. But it is in the Java language. And since processing is just built on top of Java, we can make use of them. But we're not making use of it from processing side. We're making use of it from Java. It's not that important, but I wanted to point that out here. But again, arrays, and another thing about arrays that I find a little bit difficult is that it has a lot of syntax that's unintuitive. Like the way you access a certain element, you got to know the index, and if you want to add something to the array, you have to know the exact index of where you want to add it. You got to know the index of the slot that you want to put it in. So that can be a bit hard to wrap your head around. But ArrayList, I think their syntax easier to read. You'll see here in a second that if you want to add something to an array list, it's very easy and very straightforward. It's actually called add. It's an add method. So it's going to be very easy to understand. And so you'll see an example of that here in a second. Same thing if you want to remove something from an array list. That's pretty easy as well. Now, they are both useful. I don't want to make it sound like that array lists are better than arrays all the time, because there are times where you do want your collection of things to have a fixed size. There are times when that may be useful. If that is the case, then I would recommend using an array, because with an array list, there's always a risk that you may accidentally remove something or add something and it will throw off your number. But an array will not let you do that, right? Because it's always that fixed size. And so there are times when an array makes more sense. And an array is really easy with an array to just fill it and then just leave it be, because it doesn't change, right? You just fill it at the beginning and then you just operate on everything in the array. You're good to go. An array list, there can be more going on, because what's nice about it is that its size does change, but then you probably have to control that, right? You have to say, well, how are things added? How are things removed? If I say to remove something, what thing is removed? Is it the oldest thing? Is it a specific thing? So it does have its own set of complexities. So I don't want to make it sound like that array lists are just better than arrays in every way possible. They're just different, right? There's still collections of things, but they are used in different applications. And so hopefully that makes sense. But let's go ahead and talk about array lists themselves. It won't take very long. I want to talk about how to declare an array list, how to initialize it. You'll see that to declare it, and I'll show you the actual code of this in a second, but you actually type out the word array list. And then you actually have the less than symbol and then a greater than symbol, and in between that, it's going to be whatever type of thing should be in your array list. So just like an array list can only have one type of thing. So if you have an array list and it has an int, it can only have ints in that array list. Or if you have an array list and it has something of type ball, because of a class, you're making a new type, right? A new species, a new type. If it has a ball in the array list, it can only have balls in that array list. So just like an array, it can only have one type inside of it. But the way to declare it is you would say the word array list. This does not change. It's not a placeholder here. You actually type out array list. Less than symbol, whatever your type is, greater than symbol, and then the name of your array list. And that can be whatever you want, right? Just like anything else. To initialize it, and remember, when you initialize things, you tend to do this in your setup, just like with arrays or a variable. But you have your name, whatever you decided to name your array list is going to be equal to a new. You say the word array list again, and then you have the type with the greater than symbol and less than symbol, and then parentheses, with nothing in the parentheses. So this will initialize your array list. Now notice that the difference here is that I never told it what size it should be. unlike with the array where I had to explicitly tell it the size. Here, I don't have to do that. I also did not fill it necessarily in the setup. You can if you want to, but you don't have to. With an array, if you want to make use of it, you need to fill it at some point. An array list, though, you tend to be more flexible about where you can fill it. And so, okay, this is the slide. Let me go back to my example here. Let's actually look at this. So when I declared my array list, I call my array list ball list because it's an array list of bouncing balls. So I called it ball list. The way I declared it is I said the word array list. And you see when I type out array list like this, it turns orange. So processing is telling me, says, hey, Chris, I know what that is. I recognize what this command is. And it tells me that by making it orange. I then have my less than symbol and I have a greater than symbol. And in between those, I have my type. Now, my type is ball. The reason I can say that is because I have a class called ball. But if you wanted it to be an array list to store a bunch of ints, you would say int here. If you wanted it to be storing strings, you have string. If you wanted it in booleans, you'd say booleans. You know, whatever your type is, you would have that there. I'm having mine be type ball. And then I have my name, and I just called it ball list. So I've declared my array list at this point. I've not initialized it yet. I still need to initialize it, but I have declared it here. To initialize it, you tend to do that in your setup. I just said ball list is equal to a new, because I'm making a new array list. The word array list, again, it's orange here. My type, between the greater than symbol and less than symbol, and then empty parentheses. You'll never have anything in these parentheses for an array list, but you have to have them still. And that's it. That's how you make an array list. Now, we still need to talk about, though, how can you add and remove things from this list, and that's what we'll talk about next. So let's bring that up. And so I want to talk about some methods for an array list. So let's say you want to add something to your array list. All you have to do is say ArrayList.add. So when you say .add, and then inside you have some parentheses, whatever you put in these parentheses, it's going to add that to the array list. So like when I added my ball to the array list, I said balllist.add new ball. And I'll show you what that looks like in the example here in a second. If you want to remove something from an array list, you just have your array list name, .remove, and then parentheses, and then the index of whatever it is you want to remove. So if you want to remove the first thing in your array list, you would have a 0 here. If you want to remove the third thing, well, the third thing has an index of 0, 1, 2, has an index of 2, so you would put 2 here and remove the third thing. Now, if you want to retrieve something from the array list, you would say your array list name .get, and then whatever index. So if you want to get the first thing and then do something with it, you would say, hey, my array list.get, the index of the first thing, which is 0, and then that will give you the thing. You can store it as a variable or something like that. If you want to know the size of the array list, because let's say you want to loop through the whole array list so that you can tell it to do something to each thing in the array list, you need to know the size of the array list. So you just say whatever your name of your array list, .size with empty parentheses. That will give you the size of your array list. And this is actually especially useful because remember, the size can change over time, right? But if you say .size, it will always give you the correct size. So keep these in mind. We have an add. That will add something to the array list. Remove, that removes something from the array list. .get, that allows you to retrieve something from the array list. You don't change the array list itself, but allows you to retrieve something from the array list, and then you can store that as a variable and then do some things with it, like render it or move it or whatever. Change its color, something like that. And then we have the size method, which allows you to just know the size of the array list at this point in time. And one last thing I want to talk to you about is an enhanced for loop. So we talked about with arrays, how we can use a for loop to actually loop through the whole array, which then allows us to either fill the whole array or access each thing in that array. So it's very helpful and very useful for us. I want to talk about a different kind of for loop that can be used with ArrayList that will kind of do the same thing. Because if we think back to the for loop within an array, it kind of was dependent on the size. We can still use that same type of an array with an ArrayList, but there's another type of for loop we can use, which I think is going to be very useful for us as well. That's called an enhanced for loop. How do you write that? And again, I'll show you the example in code here in a second. But you have the word for, because it's still a type of for loop, so you still have a for. you then have a parentheses. And what you're going to do is you're going to make a variable between these parentheses. So I made a variable here called ball1. Since it's a new variable, I got to give it a type. So I have a type and then the name of my new variable. This new variable is going to be equal to whatever is inside my array list. It's going to be, at first, it's going to be equal to the first thing in my array list. It's going to loop. Then after that, it's going to be equal to the next thing in my array list. It's going to loop. Then do the third thing, then the fourth thing. And so hopefully that makes sense. I'll give you a more concrete example here in a second. But just you need to know that you make a new variable. You got to give it a type and give it a name. And then you put a colon here, something we have not seen before. So new variable with the type and name, colon, and then whatever your array list is. Now, the way I read this, like in English, if I'm looking at code and I read this as saying for every ball, and let's call it ball1, in ball list, do these things. So it's basically saying for every element, for every slot in my array list, call that slot ball1 for the array list ball list. And then, well, what do you want to do with ball1? Well, render it, move it, wall detect, whatever it is you want to do with every entry in the array list. And so as you go through this loop, it's going to loop for as many times as there are slots. So if there's 10 slots in my array list at this point in time, it's going to loop 10 times. Okay. And so ball1 is going to be, for the first loop, for the first iteration of my for loop, ball1 is equal to the first thing in my array list. So if it's equal to the first thing, that means for the very first ball in my ball list, it renders it, it moves it, it wall detects it. After that, ball1 is now no longer equal to the first thing, it's equal to the second thing. So then it says, okay, for the second thing in ball list, render it, move it, wall detect it. After that loop, ball list is no longer equal to the second thing, it's now equal to the third thing. It renders, moves, and wall detects, and it goes on from there until it reaches the end of the for loop, or end of the array list. And so this enhanced for loop will actually do something to everything in the array list. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's actually take a moment and go back to the example. And let's take a look. And so we talked about how I declared my array list. We talked about how I initialized it. Let's now look at how I use an enhanced for loop to go through it. So my enhanced for loop, in fact, I'm going to put a comment here, enhanced for loop that goes through the entire array list. So for every thing in my array list, for everything, call that thing ball1 because it's a type ball. This colon you read is in, so in ball list. Render that thing, move that thing, and wall detect that thing. So basically, for every element in ball list, render it, move it, and wall detect it. I also have it so that if you look at my mouse press function, whenever I click the mouse, I add a new ball. And I do that by using my add method. That's what we talked about a couple of slides ago. So I just say ball list.add. That allows me to add something to the array list, which makes it bigger, right? What do I want to add? Well, I'm just adding a new ball. New ball is, of course, just using my constructor from my my class here. So add a new ball. Now, what if I want to remove a ball? Well, I wanted that to happen whenever I pressed a key. You see, okay, key press, and I have this ball list.remove 0. Remember, this number here is the index of the thing I want to remove. So I just told it to remove whatever the first thing in the array list is. So that means remove the oldest thing in my array list. But you see, I also have this if statement here. Why do I have that? I'll tell you what. I'm going to comment this out for a second. And then I'm just going to have the remove here. Start remove 0. And I'm going to press play. We're going to see why I have that if statement here. So if I add some balls, okay, and then let's say I start removing them, remove, 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 remove. Let's say I click remove now. You'll see processing actually is freaking out. It's giving me an error here. And so because I'm having an error, everything breaks down, right? It breaks the whole program. And so the error is that I'm telling it to remove something in the array list, but at this point in time, I didn't have anything in my array list to remove. And so because I'm trying to remove something, but there's nothing there, it freaks out. And so this if statement here helps me deal with that. So let's take a look at that. Do that. Okay, so what is this if statement saying? If the ball list size is greater than 0. So this is saying if there is at least one thing in the array list. So if there's at least one thing, then I can remove it. If there's not at least one thing, then don't try to remove anything. So this actually what helps me so that, if I have some balls here and I remove them, I can keep pressing the key, and you see processing is not throwing an error because it's not actually trying to remove anything because there's not at least one thing in the array list. So hopefully that makes sense. And that's basically it. So this is me using the add, me using remove, and me using size. So you can use this for a game or something like that. If you're generating, planes to come on down, you can add those to an array list, and then if they get destroyed, you can remove those from the array list. And that's that. I will say I didn't talk about how to use the .get, but if you ever want to just access a certain thing in a array list, like let's say I wanted to access let's see, how about if I make it where whenever I press the U key, let's say, if key equals U, I want to make the first ball in my list red, right? Sorry, that should be a character. There we go. If key is U, if I want to make the first thing in the first ball in my array list red, what I can say is just, I can go and say, make a variable called first ball. It's going to be equal to ball list, and I want to get the first thing in that list. So I can say .get 0. That allows me to get the first thing in that array list, right? So then I can say first ball dot color. Let me see, what did I call it? I called it fill color. Dot fill color is equal to red. So whenever I press the U key, this should happen. Save it. Press play. Let's add some balls. So this line of light green one is my first ball. I press the U key. Oh, and it removes something first, though. Interesting. Yeah, so actually, let's not remove it for right now. So that purple one's the first one. If I press the U key, it made it red. So it flipped out before because it removed something and then did it through the first ball, so it kind of transitioned. But you can see, if I want to do something to a very particular element in my array list, I can use the .get method to do that, right? Then I can change it in some way if I want to. I can do some different things with it. So again, we'll test this again just so you can see. If I had some balls, this pink one looked like it was the first one. Press the U key, turns to red. If I want to make the size bigger, let's see what variable controlled size. It was D. So if I went to, if I said .d, made the size 200. Let's see what that looks like. Add some, I think it was this little tiny one. So press D. Oh, what I do here? D. Red. Press the U key. There it goes. Okay. I think I pressed the wrong key. But you see, that was the first one and made it big. I'll do it one more time. So you can see it was this green guy. Press the U key. It gets really big. And so, the get method just allows you to access a certain one. And then once you access it, you can do different things with it. And so I think that's all I want to cover. My challenge for you is go back to, like, if you did the ball assignment, go ahead and do the same thing as we did today, or that I showed you with the balls moving around. But go to your bubble assignment and make it where whenever you press, like, the A key, you start adding bubbles. And then if you want to remove bubbles, press the R key. So then, same thing. I have an array list of bubbles. You just make it so that you can add and remove them over time. So give that a shot and see what you can do there. And so thank you so much for your time. I hope this was helpful.